Gerald, let's talk before this gets bigger. This is about the estate, the money that's gone from the
9
widows.
years I have done this work, and you come in here with
Gerald.
every case I've ever managed is documented to the hour. You will not stand in my office.
Her home sold to your own.
Gerald Pruett operated without oversight for nearly 4 years as a court-appointed conservator in Pinemont County, Oregon. An 87-year-old widow with dementia depended on him entirely. Not one person checked until it was far too late.
Company,
You
Gerald.
had better have more than a relative's complaint, because I will bury you in.
She would never get the chance to explain where her house had gone. By the time her great-niece stood in the county clerk's office, asking why the deed to Eleanor Brandt's home on Larkspur Lane had been signed over to a limited liability company nobody in the family had ever heard of, the man who had signed it, the same man a probate judge had trusted to protect her, was already 3 years and $2 million into stealing every dollar Eleanor's late husband had left behind, 90 months in state prison, $2.04 million in restitution, and a single spreadsheet hidden on his office computer that told the whole story in one line. Before we go any further, have you ever thought about who would manage your affairs if you couldn't do it yourself anymore? A spouse, a child, or a total stranger a judge picked from a list? Drop a comment and tell me who's on your list. And if you're not subscribed, now's the time. We cover cases like this one every single week, and the details on this one only get worse from here. Gerald Michael Pruett was born in La Grande, Oregon in the fall of 1967, the middle son of a hardware store owner and a bookkeeper who kept the store's ledgers on her kitchen table every Sunday night after church. His father sold nails and paint and lawnmower parts to the same farming families for 31 years. His mother balanced the books, filed the sales tax, and taught her 3 sons that a man's word and a man's numbers had to match, because in a town of 6,000 people, one would eventually give the other away. Gerald was the meticulous one. His older brother joined the army. His younger brother took over the hardware store when the father's back gave out in 1994. Gerald went a different direction. He was the boy who alphabetized his baseball cards, who kept his allowance in a small spiral notebook with running balances, who once, at age 11, corrected the arithmetic on a receipt at the grocery store loud enough that the cashier had to open her drawer and count it out again. He graduated from La Grande High in 1985, worked 2 years at his father's hardware store to save money, and then enrolled at Oregon State in Corvallis. He picked accounting because accounting made sense to him, and because his mother said it would always find him work. He finished in 1991 with a bachelor's in business administration, a 3.6 grade point average, and a job offer from a mid-sized firm in Salem that specialized in estate and trust administration for older clients. For the first 8 years of his career, Gerald Pruett was, by every account, exactly what he appeared to be: a competent, unshowy accountant who was good with elderly clients because he never rushed them, never interrupted them, and always brought his own pen. He took the CPA exam and passed it on the first attempt. He got engaged in 1994 to a paralegal named Karen who worked in the same building, and they married the following June at a small ceremony at Timberline Lodge. Their daughter Catherine was born in 1998. Karen quit her paralegal job and stayed home. Gerald, meanwhile, watched what his older colleagues did and started to see a specific niche in the elder care space that most accountants ignored: professional fiduciary work. When a court needed someone to serve as a guardian or conservator for a vulnerable adult with no willing family, judges reached out to the same short list of licensed private professionals over and over again. The work was steady, the court set the fees, and the clients, by definition, could not object. In 2001, Gerald Pruett obtained his Oregon Certified Professional Fiduciary License. He opened his own practice, Cascade Guardianship Services, in a small storefront office on the ground floor of a converted craftsman house on Maple Street in downtown Pinemont, Oregon. He hung a modest sign, printed business cards on cream card stock, and drove to the county courthouse the following Tuesday to introduce himself to every probate judge who would give him 10 minutes. The work came slowly at first, and then, once judges knew his name, all at once. By 2005, he was managing 16 active cases. By 2010, 40. He was appointed to the county's Elder Services Advisory Board. He gave talks at senior centers on estate planning. He showed up to every hearing with those color-tabbed binders that his colleagues teased him about. Blue for banking, yellow for property, red for medical, green for court filings. And judges appreciated that when Gerald Pruett said he had the answer, he could produce the answer in under 15 seconds. His performance evaluations from the state licensing board were consistent for the first 15 years. Detail-oriented, reliable, demonstrates strong understanding of fiduciary obligation. One reviewer wrote, in 2013, that Pruett showed exemplary care in his written communications with the families of protected persons. Another, 2 years later, called him the kind of professional the profession needs more of. He was, in short, exactly the person a probate judge wanted to appoint when a vulnerable adult had no one else. Which is exactly why, when an 87-year-old widow named Eleanor Brandt walked into the Pinemont County Probate Court's orbit in the spring of 2020, Gerald Pruett was the first name the judge wrote down. To understand what happened to Eleanor Brandt, you have to understand what a conservatorship actually is and why the system that created it was built to be trusting. When a person becomes incapacitated by dementia, by stroke, by injury, and cannot manage their own financial affairs, and when no family member is willing or able to step in, the state does not simply let that person's money sit unmanaged. A judge can appoint a conservator, a legal stand-in with signing authority over every dollar the incapacitated person owns. That authority is, in a practical sense, absolute. The conservator can access bank accounts. The conservator can sell real property. The conservator can direct Social Security payments, negotiate with creditors, pay bills, and make investment decisions. Everything a competent adult can do with their own money, the conservator can do with the money of the person they are appointed to protect. The check on that authority is the annual accounting. Every year, the conservator files a report with the probate court listing every dollar taken in and every dollar spent, with receipts and supporting records. In theory, a court examiner reviews these accountings, asks questions, and flags anything that looks wrong. In theory. In practice, the Pinemont County Probate Court, like most county probate courts across the country, was chronically understaffed and buried in filings. One examiner reviewed the annual accountings of more than 200 active conservatorships. She had 6 days per case, on paper, and in reality often less. She was looking for internal consistency. Did the numbers add up? Not for fraud. She had no authority to subpoena underlying bank statements. She trusted what the conservator filed, because the conservator had signed the filing under penalty of perjury, and because the system, in the end, ran on the assumption that a licensed professional would not lie to a judge. That assumption is what Eleanor Brandt's estate paid for. Eleanor was 87 years old the first time her name reached the probate court. She had been born in 1933 in Portland, married her high school sweetheart Walter Brandt in 1953, and moved with him to Pinemont in 1961 when he took a job as a mechanical engineer at a paper mill. Walter died of a heart attack in 2011. They had never had children. Eleanor kept the house on Larkspur Lane, a modest 3-bedroom ranch with a rose garden in the back that Walter had planted for her 30th birthday, and she lived there alone, quietly, for the next 9 years, on his pension, her Social Security, and a brokerage account they had built together over 5 decades. By early 2020, at 87, she was in early-stage dementia. The bills had started going unpaid, not because she didn't have the money, she had over $2 million in assets, but because she was forgetting to open the mail. A hospital social worker, called in after Eleanor was admitted for a mild fall, noticed the pattern and referred the case to the probate court. There was no family in state. There was a great-niece in Colorado, but no one had her phone number. There was no one in Pinemont willing to step in. So the judge called Gerald Pruett. The order appointing Gerald Pruett as conservator of the person and estate of Eleanor Brandt was signed on April 22, 2020. It gave him full authority over her bank accounts at U.S. Bank, her brokerage account at a regional firm that held roughly $1.1 million, her Social Security and pension income, and her paid-off home on Larkspur Lane, appraised that spring at $322,000. For the first 90 days, he did exactly what a conservator is supposed to do. He drove out to Larkspur Lane, took an inventory of the contents. He photographed her rose garden. He met with her twice, patiently, at her kitchen table, explaining what a conservator was and that he would be handling her bills going forward so she wouldn't have to worry. She thanked him and offered him a cookie. He arranged for a part-time home health aide to come 3 days a week. He filed the initial inventory with the court, and then, quietly, in the small, closed office on Maple Street, where no one could see what he was doing, he began. The mechanism, as prosecutors would eventually lay it out for a jury, worked in 4 layers. The first layer was the fiduciary fees. Oregon allows a licensed professional fiduciary to bill a protected person's estate for the reasonable value of services rendered. Reasonable value, reasonable time, reasonable rate. Gerald Pruett billed Eleanor Brandt's estate for services that were neither reasonable nor rendered. In the first year alone, he invoiced her estate for over 400 hours of professional time. Phone calls that never happened. Care coordination meetings that appeared nowhere in any records. Asset review projects billed on days he was documented, by his own credit card records, to be at his boat slip on the Columbia River. The estate paid him, in year 1, over $87,000 in fiduciary fees for a client whose actual needs took, at most, 4 hours a month. The second layer was the pooled management account. Gerald Pruett managed, at any given time, between 30 and 50 active conservatorship cases. Rather than keep each protected person's liquid assets in their own separate accounts, he moved everyone's cash into a single commingled account at U.S. Bank, titled Cascade Guardianship Services Management Account. He told the court this was for administrative efficiency. In reality, it was a slush fund. Money flowed in from 30-plus estates. Money flowed out to Gerald Pruett. Tracing any single dollar back to any single victim became, without forensic accounting, effectively impossible. If Eleanor Brandt's estate showed a $15,000 transfer to the management account, and Gerald Pruett showed a $15,000 transfer to his personal checking account 2 hours later, the coincidence was suggestive, but the paper trail was broken. Stories like this don't get the coverage they deserve. Elder financial abuse costs American seniors an estimated $3 billion a year, and cases like Eleanor Brandt's, where the thief is the very person a judge appointed to protect her, are more common than most people would believe. If you want to see more accountability content on cases the mainstream press ignores, subscribe and hit the notification bell. We're heading into the part of the story where the whole thing starts to unravel, and it started with a phone call the court had nothing to do with. The third layer was the house. On September 8, 2021, Gerald Pruett filed a motion in probate court for authority to sell Eleanor Brandt's home on Larkspur Lane, arguing that she would never return to independent living and that the maintenance costs were draining the estate. The judge, seeing a professional fiduciary he had trusted for a decade, signed the order without a hearing. 6 weeks later, the house was sold to an Oregon limited liability company called Larkspur Holdings, LLC, for $310,000, roughly market value. What the court did not know, what no one asked, was that Larkspur Holdings, LLC had been formed in July of that same year, with a registered agent address that matched Gerald Pruett's own office on Maple Street. Its sole member was a Delaware entity that traced, through 2 more layers, back to Gerald Pruett personally. 8 months later, in May of 2022, Larkspur Holdings, LLC resold the house on the open market for $401,000, the property having appreciated with the regional real estate boom. The difference, $91,000, went not to Eleanor Brandt's estate, but into Gerald Pruett's private bank account through a chain of transfers that took forensic accountants 2 months to untangle. The fourth layer was the most brazen. Gerald Pruett stopped bothering to hide small personal expenses. Payments to his American Express bill were coded in Eleanor's accounting as vendor disbursements. The monthly lease on his 32-foot cabin cruiser at the Portland Yacht Club, $740 a month, was billed to the estate as storage and maintenance. Tuition payments to Pacific Ridge Country Day School, his daughter Catherine's private high school, at $19,000 a semester, were run through the management account and coded as professional education. By the fall of 2023, roughly 3.5 years into the conservatorship, Gerald Pruett had drained approximately $1.6 million from Eleanor Brandt's estate. The brokerage account, she had been told, in her occasional lucid moments, was growing nicely, was down to less than $90,000. The rose garden on Larkspur Lane belonged to a family from Beaverton, and Eleanor herself had been moved, quietly, from an assisted living community she could afford to a shared-room budget care facility on the outskirts of Pinemont, because her account balance no longer justified the more expensive placement. Nothing in the annual accountings Gerald Pruett filed with the probate court reflected any of it. His filings showed steady maintenance of assets. His filings showed reasonable fiduciary fees within statutory guidelines. His filings showed everything the examiner needed to see, and nothing the examiner would have flagged. No one noticed, no one checked, and Gerald Pruett, in the quiet privacy of his office on Maple Street, had begun keeping a second set of books. Her name was Rebecca Ashland. She was 34 years old, an emergency room nurse who lived in Fort Collins, Colorado, and she was Eleanor Brandt's great-niece, the daughter of Eleanor's sister's son, a family thread so thin that Rebecca had met her aunt in person only 3 times in her life. The last visit had been in 2016. She had exchanged Christmas cards with Eleanor every year since, in Eleanor's shaky but still legible handwriting, until 2022, when the cards had simply stopped. In September of 2023, Rebecca Ashland took a week of vacation and drove from Fort Collins to Pinemont, Oregon, to see her great-aunt. She did not call ahead because she was not sure Eleanor still had a working phone. She drove to Larkspur Lane on a Tuesday afternoon. The house was not empty. There were children's bicycles on the front lawn. There was a minivan in the driveway. A woman Rebecca had never seen before opened the front door and, cautiously, told her that they had bought the house in the spring of 2022, and no, she did not know where the previous owner had gone, only that the sale had been handled by a real estate agent representing an LLC. Rebecca Ashland stood on the sidewalk of Larkspur Lane for 20 minutes trying to figure out what she was looking at. She drove to the Pinemont County Courthouse the next morning. She asked a clerk in the probate department how she could find out what had happened to her great-aunt. The clerk pulled up the file on her computer, wrote down the name of the conservator, Gerald M. Pruett, and the name of the current facility where Eleanor was being cared for. Rebecca drove there that afternoon. Eleanor Brandt was in a shared room. She was in a wheelchair. She recognized Rebecca after several minutes, and she cried, and she asked, over and over, why her house was gone and why her things weren't there. She could not remember the last time she had spoken to anyone from her family. She could not remember signing anything, and when Rebecca gently asked about money, Eleanor said, in a small voice, that she was told there wasn't any left, and that she was sorry for being a burden. Rebecca Ashland drove back to the courthouse. She requested copies of every annual accounting Gerald Pruett had filed on the Eleanor Brandt case. She sat at a table in the clerk's office and read them. She did not have an accounting background, but she was an ICU nurse. She read patient charts for a living, and she knew how to look at a document and ask whether the numbers on one page matched the numbers on another. They did not. The fiduciary fees looked absurd. The property sale on Larkspur Lane showed a sale price roughly $100,000 below market to a buyer whose name she did not recognize. The line items for vendor disbursements were not itemized. There were no receipts attached. There were entire quarters where the accounting simply said, management account transfer with no explanation. She spent 3 days in Pinemont. Before she drove back to Colorado, she filed a written complaint with the probate court asking for an independent review of the Brandt conservatorship. She named Gerald Pruett. She attached copies of the accountings with her handwritten questions in the margins, and she left her cell phone number. That complaint landed on the desk of a court examiner named Denise Voss on October 2nd, 2023. Denise Voss had reviewed the Brandt file every year and had never seen anything wrong with it. She read Rebecca Ashland's complaint twice. And then, for the first time in her 17 years as a court examiner, she picked up the phone and called the Oregon Department of Justice. The Oregon Department of Justice assigned the case to a senior financial crimes investigator named Marcus Beltran, a former forensic accountant who had spent the last 11 years of his career untangling exactly this kind of scheme. He pulled the underlying bank records first. He did not tell Gerald Pruett he was looking. The bank records told him everything he needed to know within 72 hours. There was a pattern. Every 3 or 4 weeks from May of 2020 forward, a wire transfer would leave the Eleanor Brandt trust account at U.S. Bank and land in the Cascade Guardianship Services management account. Within 2 to 4 hours, sometimes within 30 minutes, a transfer of a nearly identical dollar amount would leave the management account and land in Gerald Pruett's personal checking account at Wells Fargo. Marcus Beltran laid the transfers out on a spreadsheet and stopped counting at 92 separate paired transactions. Then he pulled the deed history on Larkspur Lane. He found the sale to Larkspur Holdings, LLC. He pulled the Oregon Secretary of State filings on Larkspur Holdings, LLC, and found the registered agent, Cascade Guardianship Services, 218 Maple Street, Pinemont. He pulled the Delaware records on the sole member of Larkspur Holdings, LLC, and, through 2 more layers, arrived at Gerald M. Pruett, sole beneficial owner. He documented the resale of the property 8 months later. He calculated the $91,000 spread. He traced it, dollar for dollar, into Gerald Pruett's brokerage account. Then he pulled the fiduciary fee invoices. He compared the dates on the invoices to Gerald Pruett's own credit card records, cell phone GPS records, and vehicle EZ-Pass records. On 17 separate dates when Pruett had billed Eleanor Brandt's estate for 8 or more hours of care coordination, his own records placed him at his boat slip in Portland, at Pacific Ridge Country Day School events, or on interstate travel that made in-person care coordination physically impossible. By November 14, 2023, Marcus Beltran had a 200-page investigative report and a search warrant. On the morning of November 15th at 7:15 a.m., a team of DOJ investigators and Pinemont County Sheriff's deputies executed the warrant on the Cascade Guardianship Services office on Maple Street. They seized every filing cabinet, every hard drive, every backup tape, and every color-tabbed binder in the building. What they found on the hard drive of Gerald Pruett's office desktop, in a folder labeled Personal Do Not Backup, was a single Excel spreadsheet. The file name was, in its own quiet way, the most damning piece of evidence in the entire case. Accounts True.xlsx. The spreadsheet listed 31 active and former clients by name. For each client, there were 2 adjacent columns. The first column, labeled On Paper, tracked what the estate's official balance sheet showed. The second column, labeled Actual, tracked what the estate actually held. The gap between the 2 columns was, in every row, what Gerald Pruett had privately labeled Borrowed. Eleanor Brandt's row showed a running borrowed total that had grown, month by month, from just under $9,000 in the summer of 2020 to $2,040,000 by October of 2023. The final cell in the row was shaded pale red. In the cell's comment field, in Gerald Pruett's own shorthand, was a single note, replace before review. He never did. Gerald Pruett was not in the office when the warrant was executed. He was at a routine hearing at the Pinemont County Courthouse on an unrelated conservatorship, wearing his standard dark navy suit and carrying 2 of his color-tabbed binders. When he walked back to his office at 10:20 a.m., he found 6 vehicles in the parking lot and yellow tape across his front door. Marcus Beltran met him on the sidewalk. "Mr. Pruett, my name is Marcus Beltran. I'm a senior investigator with the Oregon Department of Justice. We're executing a search warrant on this office. I need to ask you a few questions." Gerald Pruett stopped on the sidewalk. He looked at the vehicles. He looked at the tape. He looked at the badge Marcus Beltran was holding up. His hands were still full, 1 binder under each arm. On what basis are you executing a warrant on my office? On the basis of a probate court complaint filed by the family of a protected person. Eleanor Brandt. I imagine you know the name. There was a pause. It was, according to the transcript later prepared from the audio Marcus Beltran was quietly recording, exactly 4 seconds long. I'd like to speak to my attorney. That is your right, sir. But I want you to understand where we are. We have the bank records. We have the deed history on Larkspur Lane. We have the Larkspur Holdings LLC filings and the Delaware documents. We have the fiduciary fee invoices and your own credit card and phone records for the dates you claim to be working. And we have the file called accounts.true.xlsx from your office desktop. Pruett said nothing. You marked her cell replaced before review, Mr. Pruett. That's a hard thing to explain to a jury. Pruett said nothing. Is there anything you'd like to say to me before I ask you to come with me to my vehicle? The transcript records another pause, this one 7 seconds long. Then Gerald Pruett, the meticulous accountant from Legrand, the man who had carried color-tabbed binders into probate hearings for 2 decades, the man judges reached for when a vulnerable adult had no one, said the only thing he was ever recorded as saying about Eleanor Brandt. I intended to put it back. Marcus Beltran did not answer. He walked Gerald Pruett to his vehicle. The 2 color-tabbed binders were still under Pruett's arm when the deputies took them from him and placed them in an evidence bag. The Pinemont County Grand Jury indicted Gerald M. Pruett on December 18, 2023, on 24 counts total. 1 count of aggravated theft in the first degree under ORS 164. 057. 7 counts of criminal mistreatment in the first degree under ORS 163. 215. Covering the 7 surviving clients whose funds appeared in the Accounts Box True spreadsheet. 3 counts of aggravated identity theft under ORS 165. 803, and 13 counts of money laundering under ORS 164. 170. His attorney was a Portland defense lawyer named Alan Rieger, who had represented white-collar defendants in Oregon for 28 years. Rieger initially filed motions to suppress the Accounts True.xlsx file, arguing that the search warrant was overbroad and that the file was outside its scope. The motion was denied. He filed a motion to sever the counts related to other victims. That motion was denied. He filed a motion for change of venue, arguing the Pinemont community was too small and too invested in the local elder care system for a fair trial. That motion was denied. By December of 2025, with trial set for February, the state had assembled a witness list of 47 names, including Marcus Beltran, Denise Voss, 3 other former clients or their families, Rebecca Ashland, and Eleanor Brandt's caretakers at the shared room facility. The state was prepared to introduce Accounts True.xlsx as its central exhibit. Alan Rieger, reading the writing on the wall, went to the district attorney with a plea offer. On January 9, 2026, in Pinemont County Circuit Court, Gerald Pruett pleaded guilty to aggravated theft in the first degree, 1 count of criminal mistreatment in the first degree, naming Eleanor Brandt as the protected person, and money laundering. The remaining 21 counts were dismissed under the terms of the agreement. Sentencing was set for March 14th. Rebecca Ashland flew in from Colorado to give a victim impact statement on behalf of her great-aunt, who was by then no longer capable of participating in the proceedings. My great-aunt Eleanor is 89 years old. She was married to my great-uncle Walter for 58 years. He planted a rose garden for her 30th birthday. She lived in that house for 60 years. Everything she and Walter built, everything they saved, everything they meant to leave behind, a stranger took, over 4 years, dollar by dollar, while she sat in a chair and forgot she'd ever owned any of it. She won't get any of it back in the years she has left. She won't remember that she had it. Mr. Pruett will go to prison, and I'm glad. But nothing that happens in this courtroom today gives her rose garden back. Judge Helena Voigt, who had signed the original 2020 order appointing Gerald Pruett as Eleanor Brandt's conservator, delivered the sentencing statement from the bench. She had been a probate judge in Pinemont County for 21 years. She had appointed Gerald Pruett to over 60 cases. Mr. Pruett, this court did not simply give you a job. This court gave you the trust of the state of Oregon and the trust of a woman who could no longer speak for herself. You accepted that trust in writing, in this courtroom, in front of me. You then, by your own private ledger, and I quote your own file, borrowed from her estate month after month for 4 years with the stated intent to replace what you had taken before the annual review, and you never replaced any of it. You did not take from a stranger. You took from a person the law required you to protect. There is no version of this crime that is not also a betrayal of everything the conservatorship system exists to accomplish. I want you to understand that when a system like this fails, it does not fail only the person you stole from. It fails every future protected person whose family will now, quite reasonably, wonder whether they can trust the professional the court sends. That damage will outlive your sentence. She sentenced Gerald Pruett to 90 months in the Oregon Department of Corrections, ordered $2,040,000 in restitution, permanently barred him from ever again serving as a fiduciary in the state of Oregon, revoked his certification, and entered a judgment line against his remaining assets, including the 32-foot cabin cruiser at the Portland Yacht Club. Gerald Pruett was transported to Deer Ridge Correctional Institution in Madras, Oregon, a medium security facility, on March 21, 2026. His projected release date, with credit for good behavior, is late 2032. He will be 65 years old when he walks out. Eleanor Brandt died on August 4, 2026, at the shared room facility, 5 months after Gerald Pruett was sentenced. The restitution order remains active against his estate. To date, less than $17,000 has been collected. The house on Larkspur Lane belongs to another family. The rose garden is still there. Rebecca Ashland was the only person present at Eleanor's funeral. This case was devastating. But the case waiting for you on the right-hand side of your screen right now might be the coldest one we've ever covered. Click it.